All right, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome. I want to thank you for joining us today for this really important discussion about corporate culture and inclusion. My name is Jack McDougall, and I'm the president and CEO of the Greater Washington Board of Trade. Corporate culture and inclusion are critical topics for all of us right now, especially as we navigate these challenging times and work to drive change across our region. Since I started with the Board of Trade 3 years ago, we've been looking at data from the Brookings Metro Monitor, and it doesn't really tell a very good story. For overall economic growth between 2008 and 2018, our region ranked 25th out of 53 metro areas, those with a population of more than 1 million people. And for 2009 to 2019, our region dropped to 37th. And one of the main reasons for this underperformance is the lack of overall racial inclusion, where we rank 51st out of 53. Another reason is friction between multiple jurisdictions, which is also a piece of this broader discussion about inclusion. And while many people and organizations across our region are working tirelessly to remedy these issues, we still have much work to do. The Board of Trade, working with its members and partners, continues to focus on regional collaboration, capacity building, and fostering inclusive economic growth. And now with a real emphasis on what's next as we emerge from the pandemic. We've been exploring racial and social inequities and the concrete, meaningful actions needed that will make our region more inclusive and equitable. A critical part of any organization's diversity, equity, and inclusion performance is how well it fosters a corporate culture that welcomes people of different backgrounds and perspectives. And with that, I'm very pleased to welcome our terrific guests this morning. They'll discuss and answer questions on how to champion an inclusive culture within your organization, how employers can create that culture, and much more. As we get started, I'd like to introduce our presenter today, Bryan Hancock, who's a partner with McKinsey Company. Bryan is the global leader of McKinsey's talent work. Bryan, I want to thank you very much for your support and your participation with us. Bryan's going to provide some background to set the stage and then facilitate a conversation with our panelists. Dr. Wayne Frederick, President, Howard University, and Jason Wright, President of the Washington football team. Jason and Dr. Frederick, thank you so much for spending this valuable time with us today. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature, and we will address those towards the end of our discussion. And now with that, Bryan, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, Jack. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to the conversation this morning. As an opening to the conversation and grounding us in a little bit of the facts and research, what we thought we would do is spend 10 minutes sharing some highlights from recent McKinsey research on race in the workplace, the Black experience in the U.S. private sector. This research, if we go to the next page, this research is one part of McKinsey's overall efforts looking into opportunities and challenges for Black and African Americans in the U.S. economy. This work focuses on workers, but through our Institute for Black Economic Mobility, we're also looking at the opportunities and challenges for entrepreneurs, consumers, savers, and residents. So if we go to the next page, we'll talk a little bit about how we grounded this research. Research really took place in two parts. Part one was looking at the U.S. private sector as a whole. This was a comprehensive benchmark analysis of Black workers in the private sector that looked at all 125 million total workers in the U.S. private sector, 15 million of whom are Black, about 12% representation, who work and live in a variety of occupations and a variety of locations. And so we tried to get down to some of the geographic specifics, occupation specifics, and we'll share some of that as we move forward. Part two looked at a set of participating companies. And this was an analysis of Black employee representation, advancement, and inclusion within organizations. We partnered with 24 large companies representing each sector of the economy with a total of over 3.7 million people employed by those companies. In addition to doing a pipeline assessment of those companies' pipelines, we also looked at employees' perceptions through an employee experience survey, which included our McKinsey Inclusion Assessment. So two parts of the research, one looking at the overall economy, and the second looking within the four walls of organizations. If we go to the next page, the summary findings we found is there were 10 key challenges to create opportunities for Black workers. We'll talk about these in turn this morning, but the first 6 challenges relate to that first frame, taking an economy-wide view. And the last 4 challenges are more specific, to the experience within companies. So if we start with challenge number 1, which is on the next page, as we look how Black workers are participating in the economy, there is higher unemployment among Black workers compared to other workers. What we tried to do and what we did do is then say, well, how does that look cohort by cohort? So if we take college graduates and compare white college graduates with Black college graduates, what does the story look like? White high school dropouts versus Black high school dropouts, older Black workers versus older white workers, white workers who had been previously incarcerated versus Black workers who had been previously incarcerated. In every cohort, there was higher unemployment for Black workers than for white workers, which gets at a little bit of the systemic challenge that is here. It's so when you look at the overall number, closing the employment gap would result in 480,000 more Black workers, working in the private sector. If we go to the next page, it focuses on the second aspect, which is geography. Almost 60% of the Black labor force live in the South, compared to 1/3 of the rest of the workers in the private sector. And in 10 states, the representation was less than 0.1% of the total. So there is a difference in the geography of where Black workers work. And then if you overlay on that what economic growth looks like, which is on the next slide, we segmented, and through the McKinsey Global Institute has segmented counties, all 3,150 some odd counties in the US, and overlaid on that metro areas, looked at their historic growth, their forward-looking growth potential, as well as their resilience to forces contributing to the future of work. We came up with this set of community archetypes. When you look at the fastest growing community archetypes, silver cities, college-centric towns, high-growth hubs, and small powerhouses, collectively fewer than 1 in 10 Black workers live in those fastest growing communities. Where you do see Black workers outside of those fastest growing communities are places like the urban periphery, Clayton County, Georgia, outside of Atlanta, or stable cities like Detroit, mega cities like Chicago, and distressed Americana, places like Coahoma County, Mississippi. While some of those areas do have decent growth rates, the urban periphery, mega city, and even stable city growth, we do see some growth happening there. When you double click into those communities, there's other research that we cited that shows that even within communities, there's a disconnect between where the workers live and where the job opportunities are. So this geographic angle we found to be important. If you go to the next page, we then looked at this by sector. So this is by industry. The overrepresented industries where Black workers are overrepresented are on the top of the page. The underrepresented industries are on the bottom of the page. In all of the underrepresented industries, over 90% of workers in those industries make more than $30,000 a year. In all of the underrepresented industries, they're all, the threshold for how many make more than $30,000 a year. In none of those industries do 90% or more of workers make $30,000 a year or more. So you see this industry split, and nearly 50% of all Black workers work in 3 sectors: healthcare, retail, and accommodation and food service. If we then move from sectors to occupations, which is on the next chart, again, here we look at, the top of the page are occupations where Black workers are overrepresented, and compared on the bottom of the chart to where Black workers are underrepresented. And if we take, for example, some of the biggest underrepresented areas are also some of the faster growing areas: business and financial operations, computer and mathematical, so a lot of your IT occupations, physical life and social sciences, construction, and architecture and engineering. So you do see this mismatch between not just the job types and the wage level, but also where future growth is happening. One thing that we did is said, what if Black workers were equally represented in occupations across wage levels at the same percentage as their participation in the economy? If everybody was kind of equally distributed across jobs, it would mean that an additional 2 million Black workers would move from making less than $30,000 a year to making more than $30,000 a year. If we go to the next chart, talk a little bit about what the impact is on the future of work. As we think through areas that are going to be automated, where other changes are happening to work. We've, through our McKinsey Global Institute, have looked at job growth projections. The bottom 3 occupations by projected job growth in food service, production work, and office support represent 1/3 of the Black private sector. There is a bright spot, which is one of the fastest growing occupations is health aides, technicians, and wellness, where there is good representation of Black workers. That said, Black workers are still underrepresented in the health professional category. So we're relatively overrepresented in some of the allied health, but underrepresented in doctors and some of the other health professionals. So even that bright spot does have an opportunity within it. We then looked inside the 4 walls of the company. So the next charts start to get within the companies. And the first thing we did was a pipeline analysis. So this is just saying by level across our participating companies, and we normalize for the level, where do we see advancement and representation, and what does it look like? What we see is, for frontline workers, there's overrepresentation of Black employees in frontline hourly jobs, and there's a drop off between the frontline hour and frontline salary. So about 19% of the workforce in these companies that participated about 19% of the frontline hourly workers were Black, but only 13% of the frontline salaried. If you then looked at the managerial ranks, again, entry level looked at parity. So the entry level corporate roles looked at parity to Black representation broadly, but that 12% representation dropped to 7% at the manager level and 4 to 5% at the senior manager through SVP level. And so you do see this broken rung where companies are getting Black workers in at the entry level, but they're not progressing to the manager or senior manager levels. If we go to the next chart, part of the challenge, and one of the reasons we ran the inclusion assessment, is looking at why Black workers may not want to stay in companies. And one of the things we found is that Black workers at entry level were leaving at a faster rate than their white counterparts were leaving. And so if you're starting to say, why are these entry level employees leaving? Well, lots of entry level employees leave. There's a natural churn that happens at the entry level. Why is that happening more for Black workers? And it started to ask questions around inclusion. And so one of the findings we had is there was a trust deficit between Black employees and their companies. And you saw differences of how white and Black employees perceived welcoming diverse perspectives, differences in how they perceived whether employees were being treated fairly. And on the last page here, this looked at, we pulled together a couple of sources of data. One, we asked companies what types of programs they had that supported diversity, equity, and inclusion. And 87% of companies reported having a sponsorship program. And then we asked employees, do you have a sponsor? Do you feel supported in advancement? And even though 87% of companies reported having a sponsorship program, only 1 in 3 Black workers said that they had 1 or more sponsors, and fewer than a quarter Black workers felt like they had a lot or quite a bit of support at their company to advance. And so there is a bit of a disconnect we're seeing between the formal programs that companies might have and how employees are actually feeling supported. So what does this mean for the path forward? If we go to the next chart, we recognize that activities need to happen at 2 levels. One, within the 4 walls of a company, and then separately, working on a more system level change. Within the 4 walls of the company, we focus, the idea is to really set the aspiration, understand the current state of DE&I in your company, in your company's context. that might look different in the Washington, D.C. area than it does in Seattle because of different demographics in the area. But understanding the context is important. Then be strategic about the interventions. And if something's not working, let's reinvent it. If those sponsorship programs aren't having the sponsorship type outcomes we're looking for, how do we reinvent that? And how do we have the right measures on accountability? At the same time, recognizing that it's a system level challenge, those no regret internal moves need to be paired with, sharing on what best practices are across organizations, continuing to invest in collaborative actions like the Rework America Alliance or 110, and commitment for continued investment in research so that we can continue to highlight the facts behind where we are and hopefully galvanize, continued energy and focus on addressing these challenges and really, creating it into an opportunity to build a more inclusive economy. So with that as a bit of a setting of context, I'm now excited to welcome Jason Wright and Dr. Wayne Frederick to the conversation. Jason was one of our collaborators on Race in the Workplace before he left McKinsey. And in August 2020, he left us and joined the Washington football team as the president. He's the first Black team president in the history of the NFL, and also currently the youngest president in the league. In the role, he's overseen a major transformation of the organization with a particular emphasis on culture change and inclusion. As I mentioned, Jason was previously a partner in McKinsey's Washington, D.C. office, where he helped large, complex organizations through operational cultural transformations. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks, Brian. It's good to see you, man.
Good to see you. And Dr. Wayne Frederick. I'm pleased to have Dr. Frederick join us. Dr. Frederick is the 17th president of Howard University, serving since 2014. He previously served as provost and chief academic officer. Most recently, he was appointed by Howard's board to serve as the distinguished Charles R. Drew Professor of Surgery. In his time as president, Dr. Frederick has made diversity and inclusion a major focus, raising the number of female deans from 1 to 9 out of a total of 13. And he has worked to develop pipeline programs connecting Howard and Black talent to leading companies and industries, including in STEM and entertainment. Jason, to get things started, can you tell us about the work you're doing as the new head of the Washington football team, and in particular, what you've learned about transforming the culture of a large organization and some of the challenges and lessons you might highlight?
Sure. I think we talked all the time in consulting and in academic papers on organizational health and culture, saying that business performance is not sustainable if you don't have the healthy culture to fuel it over time. And walking into this organization is absolutely the case, right? This is a great market with a fan base that's dedicated to this team and this franchise. And historically, that's made this franchise incredibly lucrative. And what I found was a business that was headed the other direction, not necessarily because any of those underlying economic or commercial factors had changed, but that we didn't quite have the people, the structure, the right decision-making processes, the supports that actually allow talented folks to thrive in the way that creates innovation, that creates connection to fans, that creates good products, that don't make us dependent on wins and losses, but make us dependent on connecting with the fan base in a consistent way. And so coming in, I had all grand plans on commercial strategy and renaming and new venue and all sorts of stuff. But I've spent the first 9 months of this primarily focused on organizational culture and health. And a big piece of that was making some tough decisions to turn over our leadership team. We needed different talent. We needed folks that align with the values of the future. We needed folks from different backgrounds. And the result has been a 90% turnover in the top team, but the net benefit has been a very diverse top team, arguably the most diverse in the NFL, and ideally making our way to the most diverse in sports, not just because of diversity's sake, but because it actually makes us better at decision making. And the insights that we get through our debates and our arguments and our top team actually create as much light as they do heat and get us to better answers. And so that's where we've been spending a ton of our time, is on people, and it's reaping benefits for us.
No, thank you, Jason. Dr. Frederick, thinking about this theme of creating an inclusive workplace, talk to us a little bit about how you're preparing young people for success as they graduate and enter the workforce, and what are some of the challenges you see, and what can local employers do to help?
Yeah, great question. Again, first, thanks for having me, and I appreciate partnering with Jason again on this. A couple of things. Young people who are coming to us today have a different perspective. One of the things I'll give you as an example that I heard someone, using in the past was when I was growing up, I didn't know who the richest person in the world was. The young people who come to us today, they know who that person is. They know what he or she wears, what jet they fly, et cetera. So that creates a certain sense of entitlement from a different perspective, that they don't see those things as being totally foreign to them or totally, unachievable. The how they get there is really the issue. So we have very ambitious young people who don't necessarily are willing to succumb to their barriers. They're going to work hard. And what we have to do is to continue to move those barriers from in front of them. And those barriers a lot of times are institutional barriers because of how our society has been set up and some of the history that does exist. But once we empower them with that, I think we're seeing them grow. The second thing that we've tried to do is to close the gap between us and industry. In the past, I think the corporatization, as it were, of higher ed is something that faculty members are always very concerned about, because they're concerned that they're doing God's work and they don't want that tarnished by any corporate activity that might come into the space. We've tried to turn that around, and what we're trying to do actually is embed our students and faculty with corporate partners, because ultimately, if we want to diversify those industries, I think it's important for corporate partners to say, listen, this curriculum doesn't really work, or let's invest in how this is done. So we've done things like Howard West with Google, where Google engineers are co-teaching our students with our faculty. So our faculty gets experience about contemporary things, and obviously the students are getting contemporary information. And I think that has changed the perspective, on our hiring of our graduates in those areas have gone up. We've done the same thing with Amazon Studios on Howard Entertainment. Our students are out in Hollywood getting the same kind of instruction, and now we're building out something as well with JW Marriott in honor of Annie Sorensen. And again, the thought process is the same, that we'll have them co-teach, put some skin in the game, and I think students are going to look at those industries favorably as a result.
Thank you, Dr. Frederick. And maybe picking up on that theme, it's really inspirational to hear some of the partnerships that you've been able to create. Amazon, Google, Marriott, but as we take a step back and think a bit more broadly, aside from those types of partnerships that corporations are doing with Howard, that, as you mentioned, are making a difference, what are some of the other practical steps that companies can take? In the past 5 years, the number of people with the title head of diversity has more than doubled, right? And so companies are trying to do things, they're making announcements, they're doing things. But what would you recommend as some of the practical things, maybe for folks on this phone or this Zoom, to do?
I'm probably going to get myself in a little trouble here because I'm not a big fan of DEI officers. And I say that not because I think they're great professionals and they mean well and they do a good job, but I do think that to some extent, it takes it away from the CEO. And I really feel the CEO needs to own it. You mentioned in my introduction that when I came here, we had one woman dean out of 13. Well, my undergrad campus is 70% women. And now with the addition of Felicia Rashad as my Dean of College of Fine Arts, we actually have 10 of our 14 deans as women. The way that changed is because I took a look at that issue and I tried to figure out why. And so I made the search committees gender balanced. Everybody on the search committee had to go to unconscious bias training and cultural competency training. And as you can imagine, at Howard, asking people to go do unconscious bias training and cultural competency training wasn't met with a whole lot of enthusiasm. But every single person on the search committee that does it always comes back and says to me, I did not know that I had those biases. And then the last part was, again, I think the leader has to own it. I will not interview finalists for a decanal job unless one of them was a woman. And we're yet to repeat a search because they couldn't find a qualified woman. So I think if you set the tone from the top, it works. And I think some of what you've heard in Jason's story is exactly that you as the CEO have to own it. And again, nothing against DEI officers, but I do feel strongly that the CEO needs to have that in his or her portfolio and or be very close to the issue in the event that they do have a DEI officer.
No, I wholeheartedly agree. And I'd build on that by saying, number one, the slates piece, the hiring slates piece is absolutely critical. There's so many, you get so much resistance or protests when you think about things like quotas and stuff like that, even though I think in principle, representation and measuring it by the numbers is not off, but let's throw that out because it's so controversial. The idea of making sure that you have representative slates and a definition of representative that is based on the population in which you're serving, whether that's of your customers, of the community around you, whatever it is frankly not that hard to do, and makes a material difference, because often search firms and others have their processes that are well-worn, and well-worn processes tend to exclude women, people of color to a lesser extent, but still meaningfully LGBTQ plus people. And that is the place to focus, and that's paid real dividends for us. Me communicating from the C-suite to the workforce, come with a diverse slate, or you don't get your head count. Now, I'm not going to dictate who you ultimately hire, but if you don't come with a diverse slate, that head count's gone. Figure out how to do it another way. And that challenging message needs to be put in place. But I think it also needs to be reinforced by a broader organizational rationale for why this is important. And people differ on this. Many of my colleagues will really come down on the moral imperative of this. This is the right thing to do, and that's all true. I tend to not use that argument for diversity, equity, inclusion, better representation, et cetera. I tend to lean towards the business case. Mainly it's my cynicism, because I don't trust people to care for very long about something that's at the heart level. I don't find the human heart to be quite fickle. So I don't actually want to bet on the goodness of human beings to continue to do right on DEI. I'd instead like to tie it to the truth that better representation, more diverse teams, especially more diverse decision makers, actually get better outcomes over the long run. McKinsey's done a ton of research to back this. Academia's done a ton of research to back this. And so my organization knows that it's a business imperative that we have diversity where decisions are being made. And as a result, we will be better off in the long run. We will make more profit. There will be more growth opportunities for us. We will be able to expand and build new businesses on the back of our rebrand because of diversity. And so when that becomes the raison d'etre around the organization for diversity, equity, and inclusion, it makes a material difference. And leaders who might not normally be engaged on it are engaged on it. Partners and sponsors that might not normally be engaged on it are happy to engage on it, because it's about dollars and cents, not just about heart.
Well, one thing that we're seeing, speaking of the dollars and cents and the rationale behind building a diverse workforce, one thing that we're seeing, and our research supports it, is that companies are thinking increasingly about the geographic nature of diversity. Those that want and understand the business case of having diverse talent are now actually thinking about locating in locations where they have better access for diverse talent. One example outside of the Washington region is Microsoft opening a 4,000 person East Coast hub in Atlanta, in a historically Black neighborhood in Atlanta. That is partnering with the historically Black colleges and universities in Atlanta to create a pipeline for that talent, and is thinking about how they work in everything so they're not displacing residents of the community, but building the housing entire opportunity ecosystem. But the reason they're coming to Atlanta is because of the availability of more diverse talent than exists in Seattle. They have stated that publicly. And so as we think about the Washington region, diversity is a strength of the Washington region. We've got, Howard as a, leading HBCU. We've got other HBCUs in DC and Maryland and Virginia. I mean, this should be and is a leading region for diverse talent. So given that, what advice would you have for employers here who understand, like, hey, this is a place where diversity can be a special part of what we bring, but who may be struggling to attract or retain Black workers? What advice would you have for folks in that situation?
Yeah, I can start us off, and I'll champion the HBCU train, so it doesn't sound as self-serving for Dr. Frederick, but it doesn't make it any less true when he says it. I'll actually take a more societal lens and then talk about companies. But if you don't know this, HBCUs have been the pathway to middle class for Black folks for decades. And it's empirically true that an HBCU degree is the most correlated indicator to economic success for a Black person in the country. And that's generational. For those like me who did not attend an HBCU, typically there is someone in your immediate lineage who did, and that was the factor for economic growth and opportunity for your family. So from a social good standpoint, all of my fellow execs out there who are thinking about what they can do in a moment, for social justice in a meaningful business-oriented sort of way, it is have some robust partnership with HBCUs because it makes a difference in the long run, generationally. That said, there's a simple piece of reorienting our feeder talent approach around local sources of talent, HBCUs being one of those. Community organizations and workforce development programs, of which there are several very strong ones here in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, is another. And then also looking fundamentally at our hiring practices and our approaches to hiring. One of the things that we haven't done yet, but we plan to do, is to look at skills-based hiring for roles across our organization, and not just entry-level roles, but also management roles. And when I say skills-based hiring, I mean, we often, especially for management roles, have a barrier that is a college degree of a certain type from a certain school that ends up being a barrier to even getting your resume out of the stack to be evaluated by someone in my organization or in your organizations. And that, because of systemic barriers that are no one on this call's fault, but exists, tend to marginalize people of color or force them out. But there are a set of skills and capabilities that are very applicable to the management roles I'm looking for, but might be found in a different spot on the resume that we need almost a Rosetta Stone to interpret. I'll give an example. For early first rung, that first manager role, getting past that first rung into an early manager role, which is a challenge based on the research that you all have done. There are a set of skills that, in particular, people of color have from community organizations, churches, local nonprofits, et cetera, where you're doing blue sky strategic problem solving on a fundraising campaign for the building fund, working with senior leaders and stakeholders with egos and competing objectives in the organization, managing a volunteer workforce and managing their time in a way that is doing workforce allocation and motivation. These types of things are actually the skill sets that I'm looking for my managers in marketing or community and charitable or in these other places. But when I have my resume screen pulling people out who don't have a degree from a certain background, from a certain school, I don't ever get to that talent. And so there are a set of things to do, and things can be done more mechanically too. There are algorithms that help with this. There are companies that can help, contractors that can help you to do this, that actually surface talent of color, women in a different way, because you're looking at a skills-based lens on hiring instead of the old rote ways that we do it.
And I'm going to pick up where Jason left off. I think that analysis is also critical. For instance, as Jason said, people may be looking at a stack and looking for certain schools, et cetera, as an example. Well, if you look over the past 55 years, I believe that Harvard's MBA program has been accepting African Americans. The number one supplier of those African Americans in terms of undergrad schools was Harvard, as you would expect, and number two was Howard. So which means that if you are so interested in a Harvard MBA person, clearly Howard sends more African Americans to that program than anybody else has over the history of them accepting African Americans. So start at the source. Last year, in response to comments that the Wells Fargo CEO made, I wrote an op-ed that was published, I believe, on CNN. And the comment, one of the points I try to make is, where do we fish, right? You don't go looking for shark in a stream, right? And so you can't say to me that you can't find talent. You just pointed out, you have UDC in this area, Morgan State. You have schools like UMBC, it's a minority serving institution. So you have institutions where you can go and develop a pipeline. One of the reasons for me approaching Google about the Howard West was one of the complaints I got all the time, or two complaints in particular, was our students didn't learn to code early enough. And the second was that our students didn't do well on the technical exam. And I said, well, Stanford is located in Palo Alto, right next door to you. I have a suspicion that they probably understand the technical exam a little differently. And so let's test that theory. And sure enough, that's part of what our students get with the Howard West. So do they do much better on the technical exam now? Absolutely. But you have to be exposed to that. And I think, as Jason was saying, in terms of that skill set as well, you want people to see that. And the bottom line is that you do want people to recognize that the bottom line is going to be impacted positively by having that diverse community. The research shows that, there's no doubt about it. Jason and I probably feel the same way about it. Here at Howard, my thing is, we're doing God's work, which is what the faculty want to hear. But they want us to do it on God's time and God's money. I don't have access to the latter two. So what we have to do is hire good people that go get the money, and we do it efficiently. And so that all lends to having a diverse workforce that impacts that bottom line as well.
And Dr. Frederick, as we think about employers that, are recruiting on your campus, what are you hearing from students and from recent graduates on their experience interviewing and their experience in, early days on the job that might be helpful for folks on this webinar?
Yeah, again, a great question. A lot of these students that we have at Howard are first generation in college. They're Pell Grant students. So they don't necessarily have a role model in terms of their professional lives. And so a lot of times they're looking for something a little bit more in terms of a relationship as opposed to a transaction. And so what I think I see from my students and graduates and hear back from them is that if they get into an environment that feels transactional, they're not as crazy about that. The employers who do well are the employers who are consistent, show up all the time. People do little things that I think are also important. They reach out to students during their midterms or their finals and provide that support. Those students may not necessarily have a parent in their lives or a more senior sponsor in their lives who is keeping track of those things or has the time and ability to keep track of those things, and in those times of the year, the end of the semester before Christmas break, and in the summer, if you're a Pell Grant student, we have some students who are in foster care. So their housing is highly dependent on us being open. So something like as simple as a pandemic, as we saw, housing for them is a major issue. We can't just say, go back, to home. And so getting to know those students and recognizing and understanding their challenges and barriers as they come into your workforce is important. And the last thing is about making sure that they feel comfortable networking in that environment. I did surgical oncology. I interviewed at a place in New York for my fellowship. And I'll never forget, the night before, one of the tests, as it were, is that they took us out to a cocktail hour, and they had people observing how many people we spoke to, who we spoke to, etc. I found this out many years later. That's a test that I was going to fail, every single day of the week, because I didn't drink at the time. I hadn't had any alcohol for maybe 10 years, just out of choice. So even just going to a cocktail order and ordering water alone puts you in a different social setting. So all of those are things. And then the next day, one of the questions was, have you met someone you would like to do the fellowship with? Well, luckily, the one guy that I met, I gave his name, and luckily he gave my name as well. But again, so all of those things that I think we tend to use traditionally, not looking at the whole social construct, I think can be damaging. And so I would discourage employers from just doing those things, blanketly, but really trying to be thoughtful about looking for other ways to evaluate how people will fit in.
I love that. I got to build on that again. I think one of the things here, while the cocktail test is one that bites everyone in the butt at some point, because the mode of communication there is very tilted in one cultural experience growing up, right? Or having been around. And anything that introduces bias one way or another that isn't necessarily directly tied to the competencies and the skills you need in a job is a place where things get muddy and messy. It's like what they used to call in consulting, Brian, the airport test. Mm-hmm. You'd ask them, hey, would you like to be, stuck in the airport terminal with this person? Well, I don't know, that's not relevant. It's not really relevant. But that's what we often do. And I think we have to challenge our own assumptions and frankly, our comfort levels with how we make hires. Because a lot of times the comfortable hire, the one that gives me the best feeling of certainty and confidence, might be due to all those intangible bias factors, right? Versus the ones that are actually going to be, fit for purpose for the role. And so I think it's really important to recognize and realize that. I think secondarily, the fundamentals of HR policies and benefits and all of that stuff that feels really mundane and technical are actually really important for people of color. 401k, a difference in a 401k match because of the racial wealth gap that exists. Because there's a major wealth differential between white people in this country and people of color, those little things, 401k match, amount of vacation days that are paid, stuff like that actually ends up making a material difference, especially for entry level and first rung manager roles, that it's worth just being a best in class towards the upper quartile organization on some of those little things. And you actually end up attracting a disproportionate number of diverse candidates across the board. And that's something that I don't think we talk about very often, but is very relevant.
Yeah, and maybe if I pick up on that last point and expand it on, getting a disproportionate share. We mentioned earlier in the conversation that the Washington, D.C. area is particularly well suited to, have the availability of diverse talent, and in particular, being a leader and hiring and developing Black talent, that could be a real calling card for the region. And if you think broadly about the organization's influence, what could be accomplished, through the members here of the Board of Trade and others, what more do you think could be done to really, cement that competitive advantage and capitalize on it further?
Two things I will mention that come to mind, and forgive me, for doing this, because I know I should not put in dictates that I should not single out any one employer, but I'm going to do so today. Ben & Jerry's is a company that I am very fond of. They will never have large numbers of Black workers at Ben & Jerry's in Vermont. That's just a reality. However, everything they do around social justice jumps out at you. You can't avoid it. Anytime you interact with their CEO, you interact with anybody from the company, you interact with the store, the packaging, everything about them says, social justice. And so I think one of the things that we need to be thoughtful of is that this is not just about quota, the number of people that you hire, but it's about how you engage with the community. And while we all talk about ESG, what people want to see is that they want to see corporate responsibility, that people are demonstrating that they care and that they are concerned and that we're being good corporate citizens to the people around us. And that goes for everybody, including Howard, right? So I feel I have a responsibility to the DC public school system. So we have a dual enrollment program where we don't charge kids in the junior year to take classes at Howard, because it's part of my responsibility to say, I want to see everybody around us grow and do well. So that's one aspect. The second aspect I would say is on the issue of when you do hire, and leadership, I think is key. And you have an opportunity to do that around boards, in terms of how you populate your boards and how you populate your leadership. And I think that that's a big opportunity for companies in this area to do. And especially in DC, again, where when you meet somebody who's a Washingtonian, it's becoming more and more rare because of what has happened with gentrification and so on. But I think it will do and say a lot for people who make an effort to hire the folks who've been here for generations, and also to have your leadership reflect that diversity as well. I think that will be extremely important, and something that I think this greater Washington area and a lot of the members on here can certainly have an impact on.
Yeah, I'll build on that. First of all, the Ben & Jerry's headquarters is right near where I like to take my kids skiing in Vermont. Yes, not a lot of Black folks running around, but it's wonderful. I highly recommend it. It's a great area. That said, I'll double stamp the community aspect of this. I think that's one of the big benefits of the DMV, to gain an authentic connection to community that actually ends up driving a diverse workforce and just better overall commercial outcomes for each of us as businesses. I'm actively thinking about this as well. And I think it's from the lens of when we do have community investment efforts, charitable efforts, is actually listening to the communities in which we are located and represented and want to impact, to let them inform our CSR strategy versus a top-down or sort of force-fit strategy that is based on good things, the excitement of the workforce and alignment of our brand to different causes and all that, and then we push that down into the area. I actually think there is a community leader driven and informed approach to charitable and community investment that works really well in the DMV because of the infrastructure of community leaders that already exist here, their proximity to the challenges that are really faced across the wards and counties in the area. And it's something that I'm thinking about doing with some of our biggest efforts right now, as we're in the last legs of a rebrand and establishing a new identity for the team. We've substantially been engaging with community leaders to understand the impact of different names and brands on community, what it means for them. But the one I'm really interested in is when we think about a new venue and building a new venue here over the next 5 or 6 years, irrespective of location, that community is going to have some sort of needs, some sort of felt needs. I want to understand what those are from community leaders, from the folks in that area. And then that allows us to meet that need through our business model and not just through our charitable efforts in a way that is lasting and tangible. Because when it's tied to your business model and it's tied to how you make money, it's lasting. It's lasting and it'll perpetuate for generations. And so, let's say there's a need, we find out there's a need for K-8 educational infrastructure in the community where we ultimately end up building a new venue. Well, then why don't we actually open ourselves up and physically give our infrastructure to that need? Could kids be coming in and out of our actual building Monday through Friday to make use of this new resource that's been put in the air? That's the way that I think I want to think about it, and that I think we can all think about it more creatively, to have community informed efforts that tie to our CSR strategy and then are tied into our business model so that the impact is lasting. And then as a result, like the diverse talent starts to flow in. The product innovation that comes from the benefits of diversity starts to flow because you are talking to people who represent and come from the background that you're trying to reach, both commercially and philanthropically.
Thank you both. In the last few minutes here, we're going to turn to some of the questions. So for if those in the audience want to post questions, please put it in the Q&A. One question came for you, Dr. Frederick. How do you suggest employers partner with HBCUs that they may not have been working with in the past? It seems to be challenging to establish these, especially now given the enhanced focus on diversity recruiting.
Yeah, I think you have to be purposeful. And what we've been doing, and yes, I think there's been a lot of interest recently, but people have been calling and reaching out. We've established an office for corporate relations. The person who heads up that office for me is Debbie Jarvis. And the reason I set it up is because I do want somebody to have an area that they can go to. Not every HBCU has that, but I think you want to find out who in the organization or where it's situated. In some places, it's going to be around the career center, and you should reach out and engage. Now, what's important is that, as I think Jason said, is you want to listen. A lot of times people show up to us and what they want is to offer 4 internships a year, and that's it. And, again, the students who come here, they can't do unpaid internships. That's not how I want them spending their summer. Their financial situation isn't that simple. So they can't fly out to Seattle and put themselves up for, a couple of months. And, or even if you did offer that, they may not be able to buy a ticket, to get out there. And so that helps them make a decision. So the key is that you come willing to listen and get the exchange of ideas and see where we can match. So we are now partnering with small companies and big companies, a lot of companies in this region in particular, and we're certainly happy to do that. And I would encourage people to continue to, push. You have to be, persistent. I agree that all the HBCUs may not have all the infrastructure, but you're going to be part of building that infrastructure by being patient and working and partnering with them.
Thank you, Dr. Frederick. Jason, we've got one here that came in for you. How did you personally navigate the emotional reactions you must have faced when you rebuilt the executive team and asserted these new values and practices around DEI? How did you find the courage, patience, et cetera, to do it?
Yes, that's good. Prayer and screaming in my pillow are the two honest answers. But no, more practically and pragmatically, yeah, there's pushback and emotional upheaval, mainly because change is hard. Change is hard, and even if the ways of working weren't optimal before, it is there's an uncertainty and an instability that gets created in every individual when people start to leave the organization or the organizational structure starts to change or they have a new boss or whatever it is. And so I think the way that we navigated this was threefold. First was real, frequent, and open and honest communication. I hesitate to say transparent because people don't need to know everything, but open and honest is the approach we took. A weekly session where people could ask whatever they needed to ask about what was happening in the organization. I answered whatever I could about where we were headed. It allowed me to articulate my vision ahead of time, which helped people to get out of the emotional space and more into, or out of the negative emotional space and more into the aspirational and excited emotional space. Really laying out in those sessions sort of the clear rationale for why we made decisions where I could. So open and honest and frequent communication was one. I think number two was where we knew that there were parts of the organization that were particularly struggling with change, is we gave them some time, care, and attention. That time, care, and attention allowed them to have, focused time with me and other leaders who could answer their questions in a more personal way, but also allowed us to communicate expectations in a more clear way. So where we needed to focus, we spent the time with folks focusing. The last thing was we resourced people where they needed to be resourced, and gave people some quick wins to know that this wasn't just about moving furniture and moving people out or cutting costs in light of the fact that we didn't have any butts in seats in the season and we lost a lot of money. Like, all to undercut all of those, we made investments. We grew areas of the business. We actually changed our comp structure to get people more in line with market. And so we made real material investments in the people who were still here that said, this is a growth story. This is about a positive future. And that helped to temper the emotions. You know, otherwise it was, for me personally, like I joked, you know, prayer and screaming in the pillow, but it was also a good set of advisors, being transparent with my top team or my inner circle when I was struggling with it, but also taking the moments to look back on my whiteboard and see the larger vision that I took this job for and that I've painted for the organization. These are necessary steps to get us to the promised land, so to speak. And when I keep the big picture in context, even the very painful interim moments, you know, don't seem that sharp.
Well, in our last couple of minutes here, wanted to see if you had any closing remarks, maybe on the note of, you know, is there something that folks on this webinar should be optimistic about going forward as they're thinking about DE&I?
Maybe I'll jump in there. I'll go first because I'm the cynic. I'll have less to say. I'm cynical about everything. Maybe why I'm a good fit for this job here this time. I'll tell you one thing that gives me hope. I totally expected the focus on DEI and especially racial justice to have ebbed already. Like, we're 1 year from George Floyd's murder already, and there is still real investment and attention on that and related causes. And for a cynic who expects the attention on topics like this to ebb after 2 weeks, it's actually been very encouraging that maybe there has been a shift in mindset in the broader corporate and social zeitgeist, where we now actually are espousing this as a real value of our society, that differential outcomes for people that are primarily based on backgrounds should not persist. And that's actually something that we now broadly believe as a society, and certainly in the DMV, you know, having this panel, you know, the other panels like this that have become more frequent in number, and the questions have become more about action orientation than semantics and posturing. Man, there's a lot to be excited about, that this feels real and substantive. And that's what I'm hanging on to right now. It's just the time that this has lasted and the way that folks are really doggedly invested in making a difference on these topics makes me excited.
Yeah, you know, hope springs eternal. And this is why Jason and I are going to get along so well, because he's going to be the cynic and I'm going to be the optimist. You know, I one of the things that I have come to realize is I agree with Jason, you know, but being at Howard, we've been on a journey to social justice for over 150 years. And right now, the caravan is swollen. People have joined. We've got to make sure they leave us with gas, new tires, new engines, things like that, you know. But also when they leave, we've got to make sure they leave with an amplification of our humanity. And I think that's one of the key things about this moment. So as Jason is saying, it's been a year, but more importantly, I think that there's been an amplification of the humanity of those impacted. George Floyd was dehumanized and murdered. And I think what we have done as a country since then is to really start looking into each other's humanity. Even the pandemic has forced us to do that, right? We don't go to the grocery store and look at our grocery store clerk quite the same. You know, I hope that people are pausing to ask that person a question or two more. And I agree. I think the effort that places like the Greater Washington Board of Trade has been putting in to bring in these issues to solution-oriented levels is important. And the last thing I would say, I have a 16-year-old son who will turn 17 in a month, and a 14-year-old daughter who will turn 15 in July. And they are altruistic. They're concerned about others. If you look at any data, right, and McKinsey probably has data on this, the next generation is way more altruistic than we will ever be, and they're concerned about others. You know, I told a story about my daughter learning to sign when she didn't know anyone. who she needed to sign with. And then the next year she gets into a class, and who's in her class? A young woman who both her parents are deaf, and she goes to their house and they just light up. My daughter had no reason to do that other than just watching a show and seeing somebody signing and thinking, why don't we all know how to sign? And so that, if that doesn't give all of us hope, I don't know what else is there, but I think the next generation has us covered.
Well, thank you, Dr. Frederick. Thank you, Jason. I'm going to hand it over to Jack to close us out today.
Well, thank you so much. And Dr. Frederick, that's such a great note to end on, the story about your daughter, and we should all keep that in mind. But anyway, we're out of time today. Very good conversation. We look forward to continuing this, and as you point out, becoming more and more action-oriented. Jason, Dr. Frederick, thank you very much. Appreciate your time and support. Bryan, thank you for guiding us through this really important conversation. The feedback's been really good coming in with folks, and I'm sure we could have continued, but I do like to try to keep these to an hour, because otherwise, no matter what, even when the content's great, you do start to fade off. But anyway, have a great day, have a nice weekend, and everybody that joined us today, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. All right, bye-bye.
My pleasure. See ya.